questions. Thank you very much. Prime Minister Bondevik, welcome again.
Thank you so much to my dear friend Orlin, Executive Director of the Oslo Center US Foundation, and you for your commitment to our cause and for all your work you are doing, and also contributing to organizing these events today and for this luncheon. I have learned after many years of experience that the address at the luncheon should be rather brief because you are waiting for the food. So I'll try to be brief, and therefore, and I ask for excuse for having to leave you immediately afterwards to reach my plane back to Norway. So I have to leave it to the Norwegian linked to the, and two of them linked to the Oslo Center, to make comments and take questions and give answers afterwards. As already mentioned by Orlin, on the 22nd of July 2011, 77 people were killed in a brutal terror attack in Norway. 69 of them at the political summer camp for young girls and boys organized by the youth organization of the Social Democratic Party of Norway. The others in and around the governmental headquarters building in downtown Oslo. We found it unbelievable that this could happen in our peaceful Norway. Many also found it surprising and impressive that this horrid act was not met by a wish of revenge, but rather by appeals for reconciliation and unity, and more openness and democracy. Many Norwegians went out in the streets of Oslo, laid down flowers outside the main cathedral. They were silent. It was a very special atmosphere. And it was organized parades where people were bearing red roses in their hands. Bullets were met by flowers. Prime Minister Jens Stoltenberg stated that this terror was an attack on the open society and on our democracy. And that is true. But it was also an attack on an even more fundamental value, namely human dignity, the basic foundation for our civilization in America and in Europe. The young people killed at the island Utøya were from the Prime Minister's own Social Democrat Party, a party open to immigration. Human dignity, in my view, is inseparably linked to human rights. These two ideas are also linked to each other in the UN Declaration of Human Rights. And human dignity is mentioned before human rights. Human dignity is the main reason for democracy, that every human being has a right to influence the society. If we lose the respect of human dignity, we lose the main guideline for human behavior. And we experienced the horrible consequence of this in Norway on July 22nd last year. The legal process after the terror act has been based on the values we want to protect in our democracies, namely human dignity, law, and order. A disputed question during the process, the legal process in Norway, has been if the terrorist, who was a young Norwegian, was sane or insane. Psychiatrists presented different views on that. And that made this discussion, of course, even more difficult, and difficult for the court as well. But the court concluded this fall that he was sane, and he was sentenced to maximum number of years in prison. Many foreigners have asked, and also the foreign media from abroad who interviewed me, why the terrorist has got so much time to explain his idea, parts of it even broadcasted. The answer is that this is in line with our tradition of fairness and equality in the courtroom. In the longer historic perspective, I am also convinced that this is the best for the Norwegian society in our way forward after 22nd of July. And it will make the sentence much more sustainable in a historic perspective. That even a terrorist was treated in a fair way in the court, equal with others. We know that this terrorist was driven by a strong Islamophobia. In the manifesto he published on internet, even few hours before he did the terrorist acts, we find that he had built up images of enemies and stereotypes. Such opinions are often rooted in ignorance and lack of contact with people of other religions and cultures. Therefore, interreligious dialogue is so important. And that is also one of the program fields of the Oslo Center. In this way, we can increase the knowledge and understanding of the others and identify and use common values to mobilize for reconciliation and peace. In this regard, it's also interesting that the recent survey among Norwegians last summer tells us that Norwegians have become more positive to immigration after the 22nd of July than before. Quite the opposite of what the terrorists wanted as an outcome. At the same time, the survey tells us that more Norwegians are proud of being Norwegians. Some will see this as a contradiction. In my view, it's not. It's an interesting and satisfying outcome, because by being more aware of your own identity, you can meet others with more confidence. You know what you stand for. And then you can even more respect others who have another background. I know that the Norwegian participating in the Q&A after my intervention will elaborate more about this. What I do hope can be a positive outcome of the tragic event in Norway, 22nd of July 2011, will be a mobilizing for values on which our democracies are built, and most importantly, a deeper respect of human dignity. For this effort, we will need many actors, political leaders, NGOs, churches and other religious communities, academic institutions as universities and colleges. And such a mobilization should, of course, not be limited to Norway, but be a worldwide movement. And I want to end up by inviting all of you to join us in these efforts. Thank you and have a good luncheon.
Thank you very much, and you'll be served lunch now. Thank you very much. Good afternoon again. Good afternoon. We did a good job. We got the good Prime Minister in his car. His driver has him on the way to the airport, and he will be home with his family on the weekend, a priority for the Prime Minister. I really respect that. But it was so good to have him here, and as Dr. Myers said, so good to have him for 3 sessions. He's been a great person to work with and very responsive, and as I said on July 22nd last year, when the media wanted to talk to somebody in Norway, and I put them in touch with Prime Minister Bondevik, he was there immediately and spoke several times on Twin Cities television. As I said, we want to talk now about the aftermath. What happened after this tragedy in Norway, and has Norway changed? And to give their perspectives via questions and answers, we have the 2 women that were in the panel with Prime Minister Bondevik, Ingrid Stange, who's been introduced, and Vigdis Vevstad, who has been introduced. And we have one additional person is Hanne Aaberg, and Hanne is the Secretary General of Norwegians worldwide. She and also the Executive Director of the Norway-America Association in Norway. And she has been the Executive Vice President of Norske Skog, a large company in Norway, and Communications Director at Statkraft, the largest renewable energy company in Europe. And this is Hanne Aaberg. So she will, all 3 of the women will come up here. They each have a microphone, and we have a roving mic in the audience that will take your questions. And I'm going to ask the 3 women to come up now. And I'm going to start things off just because Ingrid is the closest to me. I'm going to say, Ingrid, give us your first impression after this happened last year, July 22nd, 2011. And then we're going to go to questions and answers. Now, when I see a hand raised, I'll just point and they'll come over with the microphone. Thank you.
Is it working? Yeah. The first impression, of course, is shock. You don't expect that to happen in Norway. But I have to I am old enough to remember the my first impression when Kennedy was killed. And the next thing I remember of those shocking was the 9/11, and then 22nd of July. It was very shocking, and in a way you understand that the world comes on a new road. And of course we were very scared. What is this? Who are these people? We didn't know it was only one. And I had a very close associate out on the island, and we heard rumors they were shooting, and I called her mother, who knew she was there, and they had no idea how serious it really was until later during the night. At the same time, my 16-year-old son was on the internet and finding the manifesto and reading it, and coming to me every half hour telling me shockingly what he was reading. And he had on the telephone a friend of his whose father was a policeman. So he knew all the rumors. First we heard there were 100, then there were 60, and then during the night there was shocking information and going in all directions. But the first, the reaction we all had was really what Kjell Magne talked about. We didn't accept this. We don't want our country to be like that. So I think we all felt that we're together. And there was of course, after the first reaction, you heard some immigrants being harassed on the bus because they thought it was immigrants, or not immigrants, but Muslim extremists. But then after we realized it was a Norwegian young boy, blue-eyed, as he said, we were really shocked. How can we, the Norwegian community, have made such a monster?
Do we have questions? Well, I can ask, first of all, do either one of Vigdis or Hanne, do you have a first impression you'd like to share?
Well, I can only agree with Ingrid that this also caused a big shock to the nation. And also, I felt the same as I felt the day on the 9/11. You feel like the whole world is in with us on this. And I think we all experienced that we had emails from people we hadn't seen since school. And it affected everybody. Not Norway, but we felt everybody was there with us, like we were with the US when the 9/11 incident happened. I want to add one thing. When it was clear that this was actually a Norwegian national doing this, in a way, it also felt like a relief, if you can use such a word in such a horrible setting. But it was a relief, and I spoke to many friends of mine who are non-Norwegian. Well, they live in Norway, but they have immigrated from other places, and they said that those days after this was clear that it was a Norwegian national doing this, they felt accepted. For the first time, we had this common enemy. We were together, and it sort of created a big sense of community feeling and cohesiveness in the society.
Yes, it is on. Oh, you heard what I said, everybody? I agree with what both my co-Norwegians have said, and I'd just like to add also that it was an experience of shock to which it was difficult to leave the television. You just wanted to be close to the media all the time and to try and find out what was actually going on. And one thing which we experienced in our house was that we knew more from our daughter, who's a journalist, than we knew from the media for quite a long time. We had more numbers coming in, and the atrocities just built up and built up and built up. But I also think that this was a situation where we managed to pull together, and we managed to actually meet terrorism with civilization. And I think this is one good thing that has come out of it afterwards, now looking back. And I also think, looking back, that, and this is also what research is beginning to show us, that Norwegian society is beginning to come back to a feeling of security and faith in each other, I mean inter-human faith, and also faith in political institutions. And so the equilibrium of the society is actually beginning to come back.
There's a question right up here. And could you identify yourself, also your name and representation?
My name is Kevin McDonough. I'm a member of the advisory committee that helped pull this together, and Dr. Sam Meyer's pastor. So I had the privilege of living in Italy in the 1980s and remember being chastised with some frequency by my Italian friends for America's terrible racism. But returning over the next 2 decades, as immigration increased and as the Italian population aged in place, I saw an absolute flip-flop. There was a kind of a tipping point in Italy. I think France, Germany, others have faced similar questions where the easy chastisement of those who don't accept the other, and the other is a small percentage of the population, switches into the harshest sort of racism and xenophobia. We're facing some of the same thing in many ways in Minnesota, where we were mostly Norwegians with a few Irish people let in, and with Hubert, Humphrey, and others, rather easily progressive and accepting. But there are those who would say that here, because our population is rapidly turning darker in color and less traditionally Christian, Muslim, for example, that there may be a turning point, a tipping point coming for us. I wonder if, as you think beyond the responding to a single terrorist act with decency, humanity, civilization, as you said powerfully, to talk about shaping a nation that will become less genetically Norwegian. What do you do to continue the growth of that civilization?
I think you're pinpointing the very challenge of Norway. We have been the most egalitarian country you can think of, both ethnically and socioeconomically. And we still have a fairly close socioeconomic situation, but it's now about 20% immigrants during the last 10 or 15 years. And I think we, although the terrorist didn't mean it, I think he has helped us on a way towards a more civilized way of accepting immigrants. It seems to me, I don't know if you agree.
I agree with you. I think the nation, the way we reacted was not to allow the terrorists to fill Norway with hate. So we sort of, it was this collective fighting back. So it has helped us, and this survey that was conducted that Bondevik referred to actually confirms that. And there is something about, I think all political theory and everybody says about a common enemy. And this enemy was something that we could all feel like this is our enemy and we're in this together. So if you can say something positive coming out of an event like that, that would be one thing.
Another question. Right over here. Oh, there's right over there, and then you'll be next.
Mine is not so much a question. It's actually, as I was listening to you, thinking about how we as a society or societies globally, what our historical reference point is with respect to who belongs where. And the reason I say that is, being an indigenous person from this land, one can argue that everyone here obviously is an immigrant, and we have this sort of humorous saying that we pass around in Indian country, that if we would have had better border policies in 1492, we certainly wouldn't be in the mess we are today. And particularly now, with the historical relevance of 150 years of an infamous historical event that happened with Dakota people here in Minnesota, and their forced removal and actual bounties on people's heads. It just seems to me that, and also that the fact that the United States was one of the last holdouts for actually supporting the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, where Indigenous peoples have a tie to their land, they have a tie to the language, they have, there's something comprehensive, holistic, sacred, special about the way traditional Indigenous people live, that I think in many ways, many of the policies, whether they're international policies or state level policies, are actually geared towards assimilation and removal in order, for the sake of increased employment and economic income. And so I just ask perhaps for each of you to comment on that particular piece of international rights of Indigenous peoples, and what your take is on some of that.
Thank you for your comment and question. I'd like to link your comment to the last comment or question which was put in the conference hall before we all had a break for lunch, because I see again from your example or from your comment that sometimes it is also necessary to draw out some particular groups in order to secure the rights which have not been there in place. I think that is important, and I think this is what we have seen in human rights development, the necessity of doing so. I mentioned discrimination against women became prohibited through the UN Convention, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is a particular convention, and so on. But then, in addition to that, I think we need the fertilization, was the word. We need to see how the special norms of protecting individual particular groups can, you know, you can learn from the workings of one into the other. You don't have to start. We have in Norwegian a saying, ikke behøve å finne opp kruttet. You don't have to, you know, explore the engine each time when you do something. We can learn in international cooperation. We can also learn from previous experience, is the point I was trying to make. I think when we look on the immigration issue and the borders, which were not there, I think we in Norway have a lot to learn from what we look at America as a melting pot, rather than, I mean, in spite of problems here now, also with immigration and issues that are being discussed, we are far behind because we are have been such an homogeneous society. But on the individual level, sorry for talking so long, but I think that's an important point also to mention. On the individual, from man to man, there is much more understanding now and much more protection of your neighbor being an immigrant than what we used to see. In the public debate of immigrants in general, it might be another story still. We still have a long way to go.
Okay, just a short comment from me. I noted your question, who is actually to say who belongs where? I think that's a good question. And I just took over the position as head of an organization that mainly is an organization for Norwegians who immigrated a couple of generations ago. And what I like to bring into that job is to learn from what my members and their ancestors, how they felt like being an immigrant to this country, and take that back to Norway and see if we can use that knowledge and that experience and put it to good use in Norway today, where we see people coming in and we see actually the way they behave, the way they organize themselves is very similar to the way our Norwegian ancestors did when they came here. So, yeah.
Yeah, and just a final short comment. It's always the winner who writes the history. And it's very interesting what you say. If you had had some better border rules, America would have been a wealthier country probably, and the soil wouldn't have been destroyed. There would be a lot we could have learned from you. The way Norway survived 150 or 200 years ago was that the second, third, and fourth, and fifth, etc. son or daughter from the small farm there wasn't room for him or her, so they went to America, and they're all here. So I think there are just as many Norwegians in America as in Norway, and that's how we managed. So we sort of just exported poverty in a way. And that's the history writer. So I think you're very valid. It's a very valid point. And we have indigenous people in Norway also, the Sami people. They were there first, and we took over, or our ancestors took over. But now at least we have understood that, so we try to not destroy more of their lifestyle. But we have done a lot of destruction. We have to agree.
You mentioned the 150th anniversary of the Dakota War. The Oslo Center also has another program that Prime Minister Bondevik did not mention. It's called the Code for Holy Sites. And just in brief, it's basically a protocol for how countries and peoples in conflict need to protect and respect places, holy places during those conflicts, and further how those holy places can be used beforehand to bring people together or to avoid conflicts, and then secondly to have them as healing places afterwards. A year ago, Prime Minister Bondevik was in Minneapolis in May last year, and we had a very moving dinner at our home with Chief Orvald Lookinghorse. And during the dinner, the chief, who's the, I may get this wrong, but the highest-ranking religious leader of the Dakota people, and someone can correct me if that's the wrong way to portray him. And Prime Minister Bondevik, who is an ordained Lutheran minister, sat together. Before dinner, the chief prayed for the food in Dakota. Prime Minister Bondevik prayed for the food in Norwegian, and then we had a sort of a Native American harvest dinner together. During dinner, we talked about the Code for Holy Sites, and Chief Looking Horse officially requested from Prime Minister Bondevik to use the Code of Holy Sites as an agreement for a code for the sacred sites of the Native Americans in this country. And it came to be called the Bedoti Peace Accord, but it was between Prime Minister Bondevik and Chief Looking Horse, and a proclamation was signed. So that agreement is there, and I hope that it's going to be an agreement that can somehow resolve some of the issues that we have in this country regarding sacred sites of the Native Americans. That was an aside. I just wanted to add that to you. Now, there was a question over here. I remembered you.
She remembered me too. I'm Harry Adler, and I was going back to a comment earlier when we all were talking about a kind of almost a sense of relief when you found out it was someone internal. I remember having the same feeling and same kind of question why I had this feeling actually back at the Oklahoma City bombing, which I actually consider more parallel than 9/11. And you're talking about lessons learned, and I feel like that Oklahoma City bombing actually, as looking back to where we are now, was actually a foreshadowing, sadly, of the polarization that exists, I think, in our society now in terms of those who promote rights and dignity for all versus those who are kind of very much concerned about what the government might be taken away from them. And so when you're talking about saying that there's this hope for what you're going to pursue forward in Norway, is there any concern that's kind of short-lived, that eventually is going to, that xenophobic sort of aspect is going to be manifested in other ways, more politically as opposed to in a more, you know, terroristic sort of way?
Yeah, I think you're right. There is a danger that this will be short-lived. But there is one thing that I think will keep it longer, which is that many of the thoughts that this terrorist, we don't want to mention his name, one of the things that, or the things that come out over and over again from him was things we remember from the Nazi period. So, and those things are absolutely not accepted in Norway. So I think he managed to show very, very clearly the closeness between xenophobia and Nazism, which can make it keep longer.
Okay, another question over here.
Yes. My name is T. Williams. I'm going to ask you to speculate. What do you think the reaction would have been and how you would have reacted if indeed the perpetrator had not been Norwegian but had been, say, an immigrant?
Since I was a spokesperson for many years, my line was always, we never speculate. I don't want to speculate, and you shouldn't speculate. So that's hard to say, but I think I think both Vigdis and I studied this report that came out just 2 weeks before we are here today. And it drew some parallels, and it compared the Oklahoma bombing and the 9/11 and also the terrorism on the London subway in 2005, and it looked at similarities and differences with the Norwegian terrorist attack. And they found some similarities, like you spoke about, that right after the incident there is this cohesiveness, we stick together, and you mobilize this rallying around your institutions. In Norway, we see that this situation is continuing. 1 year after the incident, it's still very high, and they explain it by saying that Norway has a very high level of trust. It's a society that is characterized by trust in institutions, but also trust among people. I read something like, the people who say yes to this question, you can trust most people. There's twice as many Norwegians saying yes to that, and they still are, than, for instance, Americans. So we trust in each other, and that means everybody, even strangers. A high level of trust, and the scholars say that this is part of what's called cultural capital, and that will give you resilience. And I choose to believe that even if the terrorist would have been of another ethnic background than Norwegian, I think this trust level, which you actually form when you're very young, so it's a very basic value, and you carry it all your life, I think that would have carried us through to some extent. But of course, I can't say that I'm right, but I choose to believe that.
No, I just wanted to add that I agree with that analysis. I think you're right.
But there might be some area where I am not quite agreeing. If you see the young people, there is a certain sense of I wouldn't call it xenophobia, but there tends to be a sort of gangs from various ethnical groups, and including Norwegian, and there are sort of fiendskap, what do you call that? Animosity between them, and I think that has been reduced, but it would have been increased. I think I have to admit that.
If I might add to that, I think yes, you could have special incidents, and you could have also perhaps more incidents towards the representatives from other ethnic groups. But as a totality, as a society, I don't think that there would have been a great difference. I think it would be like it is now.
I see a hand way back in the back. And then one up. Who was raising their? Oh, Jana.
My name is Babak Somak. My question is sort of a follow-up to the previous question is, if that's true, if you think it wouldn't have made any difference if it was an immigrant or a local, then why did you feel a sense of relief when you found out that the person was Norwegian? That to me was very surprising for you to say, because it seems sort of, I don't know, it just doesn't, it surprised me, that's all.
No, I can see that, but I have to be honest, it was a sense of relief in a way, because it was sort of more manageable. It's something we know, and it's one of us, so maybe that was the reason. But I agree with you, there is a contradiction in it.
Yeah, but I think also one of the reasons for the relief was that my first thought was, oh, do we need to have now much stronger borders, much more security? You know, in Norway you can find the wife of the Prime Minister bicycling around in town. She doesn't even wear a helmet. So my first reaction was, I don't want a society where we have to be so security focused. That's also part of the relief.
Yeah, thank you, Ingrid. You know what, I always think of the 9/11 incident whenever I enter an airport. I think of this airport security, and I think that's a reminder. Every time you enter an airplane, we are reminded of that, because that was a big change for everybody. It affected all our lives, and as you say, in Norway, you can actually walk around. This summer, I was walking to the office, and this guy, early in the morning, comes up to me, next to me. I saw he had his iPad, his iPhone in his hand, and earplugs in. It was the Prime Minister, and we nodded to each other and walked in parallel. I saw he had some security guys back there. It was an early morning, and that's what you will typically find in Oslo, and it's still like that 1 year after the incident.
You know, one example, you can actually drive a taxi or a car under the royal castle, through the royal castle, without anybody noticing it.
Right here, Jana has a question.
Thank you. My name is Janet Each. My question kind of tends to be more on the legal side of the issue, and I think the concept of justice and the idea of justice, and I know everybody in Norway was watching the trial and the sentencing very closely. I know the Norwegian community here was, and there was a lot of discussion about, the trial and what was taking place and the ultimate sentencing, and wanted to get your thoughts and perspectives, either personally or just a Norwegian perspective on, do you believe the outcome was just, or some thoughts on the Norwegian justice system and kind of what happened and why?
I, I definitely think that this gave reason to believe very much in the Norwegian justice system, because it was really justice as usual in a way. It was a very unusual case. Nothing similar had ever happened. But things were run very smoothly from the legal side. And also, it was a case which showed, to a large extent, the difficulty of a psychiatric diagnosis and the differences between the psychiatric, not trade, but profession, as opposed to the legal profession. And I think here, the legal profession actually won, if you like. And I think that might influence the future also. In future criminal cases, who is insane and who is not insane. Bondevik also touched on this. But I think we landed on a good conclusion. And I also think it's important to emphasize that it was very correct that he was treated in accordance with the law. So we do not have to regret, giving different rights. I think this is really a strength of our society, and I strongly disagree with those who question. I think this was a sign of weakness. I totally disagree. I think, on the contrary, I think when you're put at the test like this, I think it shows what sort of legal system you have, and I think it works.
I have to agree with you. It felt like a just procedure, and he got 21 years in prison, which is the maximum you can get in Norway, but you can then, if he behaves, actually, he can be out, but that's very unlikely. I think most people felt relief that he wasn't looked upon as criminally insane, and even the parents who had lost their children, they expressed that they were pleased or they were satisfied with what went on, and there were no. I got some comments from friends abroad who was they were a little bit surprised that there were no signs of anger outside the courtroom. For instance, there were roses, people were singing, but there were nobody being angry or crying out for vengeance or violence of any kind, and that made me proud. I felt good about it and felt just. Again, it has to, it's connected with trust, trust in the court system.
But to balance this, there was also quite some reaction in Norway that we were too mildly reacting, and that it was naive. There was, among others, a very strong newspaper chronique. I don't know what to say about chronique. Yeah. Op-ed, yeah. With one of our strong intellectuals saying that this is showing that Norwegians don't understand that there is evilness. So I think it's fair to say that there are both thinkings in Norway, and there was also a reaction that he got too much space in media. He could tell his story, and of course there are insane people out there that could be inspired by him, and we see that. He already gets letters from women who want to marry him, and there are always crazy people out there. So
there was a question right here.
Thanks. I just want to go back a second to the question before this. But there's a thing that happens in white culture in the U.S., and it looks like there might be some similarities to Norwegian culture, where this is like the Oklahoma bombing compared to 9/11, and the Columbine shooting is compared to other urban violence, and it's kind of like this. When it's a white perpetrator, they get to be an individual, and when it's a person of color, it's a them. And so I just wanted to, I know some people in this audience are already thinking about this, but point that out and ask us, or maybe ask us, white culture, U.S., and you, Norwegian culture, think about why are we, if it's a white perpetrator, why are we what's wrong with this individual? Let's investigate their parents. And if it's a person of color, that's expected. It's a them. Let's strengthen our borders. So, if you want to comment on that.
I can only say I agree. It was. I think we all have to answer on that question because it's absolutely true.
We were quite sure if we understood your question, but if I can try to rephrase, you were saying that if it's like one of us, if it's a white male in this instance, then we will start to look into his childhood and wonder if he's criminally insane, and if it was the Al-Qaeda or something, you just never question that. And I have to agree with you, and I think that's why so many of us actually felt a relief. He wasn't criminally insane. He was charged as a criminal. He's a terrorist. So I can only answer that way. That's why I think Norway as a nation was happy that he was treated as a normal. He was a criminal.
Yes, and I agree with that totally as well.
Let's have one more question. Is there another question? Right here. It's a long walk. It'll be a second.
My name is Robert Spikings, and I have this feeling that Norwegians have an overt distrust of overt nationalism. That they historically grappled with this for a very long time, and I'm wondering if that played a role in the healing and the understanding of this in its context.
You mean we have an overt distrust of nationalism? Yes, I think so, because he reminded us so much of the Nazi thinking. We didn't want to have anything to do with that. Although we have to admit that we have lots of xenophobia in Norway, which is just the same part of that coin. So we have something to work with. But when it looks too much like Nazi, we know what we mean.
So that is probably why I say that I just believe that even if it hadn't been a Norwegian national being the terrorist, the fact that we do not want to be associated with his rhetorics and the way he presented his manifesto, so I think that would have carried us through.
Oh, one more. Okay. Well, I was thinking we'd go until 1:45, so.
Thank you. It's a quick question. I guess I was curious to know, would it have mattered if he had killed someone else? You know, if like in the case in Sweden when the Prime Minister Olof Palme was killed in '86, would it have been treated differently if someone with that stature had been killed? Would people still have said, oh, you know, he's just a crazy person?
I don't think that would have been a difference, because those the kids that were killed were all potential prime ministers. They were his children in a way, and they were prominent kids. It was the best we have. So, and that was even worse than if it had been a prominent person, I think. They killed our children. I think as a mother of children the same age, I thought it was my kids. And I think everybody did that.
Okay, I don't see any more hands, so I'm going to hope there is one more. Okay. I won't keep doing this, I promise. This will be the last question.
Hopefully. My name is Mahmoud Noor. I just wanted to question the issue of religious tolerance, you know, the Islamophobia that exists in many nations. It seems we don't want to address that issue because we address that as the others. People have mentioned it. Has this changed in the Norwegian society?
I think we agree it hasn't really changed, but I think what it has changed is the understanding of the importance to keep a close relation between the religious leaders. So there is more of an effort to bring the leaders together so that we can sort of reduce the xenophobia by knowing more about our neighbor.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank Vigdis and Hanne and Ingrid for coming up and answering these questions. and actually thank Dr. Myers for asking us to present this case. This was a special request, as I mentioned earlier, from him. I'd like to mention that we have our next program, next forum, in the Cowles Auditorium at 3:45. The Fourth World Conference sessions start, I believe, at 2 o'clock. And the rest of our sessions for the dignity and empowerment, women as key to